is coming.
Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Craig Foss.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have an interesting contrast here in the House, Mr. Speaker. An earlier Labor Speaker was talking about a two-speed economy or something like that. Well, I think the MP, that member, may have been half right. There is two speeds going on at the moment. There's a forward and reverse. National, ACT, United, Māori Party, coalition government are in forward mode, into growth, looking to the future to build a sustainable growth, real job growth, real export growth economy. We have a Labor Green opposition, or where the fruit meets the loop, or where the Greens are leading Labor, we're not quite sure at the moment, to backwards, to reverse, to recession, to printing money, to experimenting with all sorts of weird and wonderful things I've read in the latest book somewhere. Mr. Speaker, this budget continues the momentum towards solid and prudent management of the Crown accounts, or the taxpayers' accounts, the taxpayers' balance sheet, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the momentum continues towards surplus, towards actual surplus. Surplus that was laughed at by the opposition not 1 year ago, surplus that they questioned, the surplus that which we're achieving, which they blocked and voted and opposed against every measure to achieve that surplus, Mr. Speaker. The opposition voted against every single measure to achieve surplus, to achieve an economy which can weather economic storms around the world. And I am surprised that Mr. Parker had the audacity in the paper to say, oh yes, but Labor would have achieved a surplus themselves anyway. How could that be? How could have they done that when they voted against every single measure to help achieve surplus, which is coming to fruition, as the documents show, next year, Mr. Speaker? And Mr. Speaker, the polls are showing New Zealand does believe this budget, they trust this budget, they're continuing the support of the national-led government in its prudent management of our accounts, of our economy in these tough times. Our economy needs to pay its way. New Zealand needs to pay our own way around the world. How do we do that? We have to manage our way through economic storms. We have to grow our economy through exports, 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 Mr. Speaker. Commentary over recent weeks, actually, Mr. Speaker, has been very positive about the budget. Very positive indeed, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But actually, reflected in the polls the other night from both TV channels, actually showed an average sustainable and solid improvement in polling for the national-led government. Interesting though, Mr. Speaker, just as an aside, when was the last time members saw a poll, National versus Labor? I can't recall the good old days, if you like, National versus Labor. It is now always National versus Labor Greens, or National versus Greens Labor. Which party is leading the charge and the debate on the opposition? When was the last time any member of the public listening saw a poll, National versus Labor? There has not been one for quite some time. So the Labor Greens potential with the opposition, the coalition, is a scary, scary thought, Mr. Speaker, indeed. And the recent lurch to the far left of the joint Politburo announcement about the nationalisation of the power industry has gone down like a cup of the cold proverbial, Mr. Speaker, not only with most of New Zealand, but actually with core traditional Labor supporters. I actually do think some of them realise that and are quite wondering how they get out of it. But let's test some of the rhetoric of Labor against what they are now saying. The current rhetoric they have against the last time they were in government. The Honourable Nick Smith was pointing to some of these points in his speech. So we need to remember, Labor took New Zealand into recession 1 year before the global economic crisis. 1 year. Yet now they're talking up GDP growth and they've got all the answers. We must remember that, because that's what we should test some of their announcements about. Labor led New Zealand into recession 1 year before the global economic crisis. Contrast, New Zealand's running at 3% GDP growth. Contrast one of the best growths in the OECD. It's quite interesting, Mr. Speaker, to actually just test the numbers. Mr. Speaker, the last the pre-election update or the December update, I can't remember which one it was in December 2008, showed us, revealed the decade of deficits of the previous Labor administration. So we must test Mr Parker's rhetoric that, oh no, they would have got into surplus, of course, themselves as well, yet the fiscal independent forecast in December 2008 was for a decade of deficits. They can't both be true, Mr Speaker. We have to test it. And interestingly, and quite weirdly actually, inflation at the time, under Labor, was running near 5%. 5% inflation under Labor. Currently, under National, 0.9% for the last year. That means, Mr Speaker, the cost of living under Labor in their last year was nearing 5% per annum. Under National, under 1%, Mr Speaker. The cost of living is much cheaper under a national government. Mr Speaker, mortgage rates, for instance. When Labor left office, mortgage rates, floating mortgage rates were near 10%, Mr Speaker. Quite how Labor got floating mortgage rates when growth was in recession, but they got mortgage rates through 10%, I don't really know how they managed that, but they did. So New Zealand families' mortgages under Labor were near double figures, 10%. Currently, Mr Speaker, those same mortgages are under 5%, Mr Speaker. What an awesome result in 5 short years, Mr Speaker. That is what prudent management, solid, economically, fiscally responsible budgets mean, Mr Speaker. They simply mean lower interest rates for longer for New Zealanders to afford their mortgages. National sub 5% mortgages, Labor plus 10% mortgages. National cost of living 0.9% per annum, Labor 5% per annum. All that means, Mr Speaker, is families struggle under Labor. Their mortgage rates are higher, and mortgage rates are always higher under Labor, Mr Speaker. Thank goodness for our children. Thank God New Zealand voted them out in 2008. And they are still in denial. They are still in denial. 240,000 children in poverty under a Labor government when they were running surpluses, but they were in recession, but inflation was at 5% and mortgage rates are at 10%. How dare they get up and talk about poverty when they were running an economy rampant with 10% mortgage rates, Mr Speaker? Absolutely outrageous. So what are their latest solutions? Well, Labor have given up themselves on running the economy because now it's joint Labor, Greens, far left announcements. Printing money. That will solve it. I don't know why Dr Cullen didn't think of that when he was Finance Minister. Printing money will solve all the problems, as the Labor Greens coalition has recently announced. Quite why it wasn't offered when they were in government, I don't know. Perhaps because most of them truly realise it's absolute madness, it's inflationary, it's essentially theft on future generations, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I just want to comment on one thing in particular. New Zealand owes the world about $200 billion. It's incumbent on all of us that there's confidence in our capital markets and certainty about the New Zealand state of affairs, so the interest rates which we have to fund that are as low as possible for the government, for our companies and of course for our families. Well, the economic grenade that Labor and the Greens threw all but 2 or 3 weeks ago about their far left power crazy policy actually adds to the risk premium of New Zealand. So that announcement actually means that mortgage rates for New Zealanders may well be slightly higher than they need to be because of the risk, the scary risk, but the risk nonetheless, of a Labor, Greens, far left coalition government. Mr Speaker, I go back again to my earlier point. When was the last time any poll showed Labor versus National? That is the record. That should be tested. At least the Green speakers are leading a debate. They're making their points. Labor comes in quickly and behind now and tries to join, Mr Speaker. But we're now seeing what a Labor Greens coalition government could look like to the far left. Mr Speaker, a solid, prudent, manageable budget, continuing the momentum towards surplus, real growth, real jobs, good for our families, half the interest rates that they once were under the Labor government. 10% interest rates, mortgage rates under Labor, 5% under National. Mr Speaker, National is by far a better manager of the New Zealand economy.
The Honourable Shane Jones.
Mr Speaker.